All right. Now, hey. All righty. How are we all doing today? Oh, so few people. I realize I'm 30 seconds early, but good Lord, up, down, around time. So today we'll go ahead and jump into the Blackburn listed inside of there as the challenges to ethics. But before we do that, I wanted to kind of go back over to just remind you of the three working definitions that we're making use of and we'll be making use of. I also wanted to say that somewhere around the halfway mark of the semester, we will begin to develop our own ethical system as a class. We'll vote on things and we'll that kind of stuff. But for what we're doing right now are the preliminaries on the way to being able to set out for ourselves our own ethical system that we could utilize to help us navigate through the world. All right, so just to remind you about these three definitions. Philosophizing is the willingness to be uncertain and the will to question, to ask questions, to keep asking questions, actually, I should probably say. Ethics is the exploration of goodwill and the overcoming of bad will. Morality is the self-actualization of ethics in your life. Okay, so today, what we want to do is take a look at one of the 7 or 8 things that Blackburn says make a challenge to the ethical. And I think that these are actually very well put out. I was kind of surprised when I first picked this book up, because all of the very short introduction books are pretty good. But I thought this one was actually really well done, considering, how much there is to deal with in the history of ethical systems and all that. So, so I just wanted to really kind of highlight this one little aspect here from the actual text, page 9. The section looks at ideas that destabilize us when we think about standards of choice and conduct, right? So in one sense, you could also talk about everything that we're doing as if ethics is the exploration of goodwill and the overcoming of bad will, it establishes certain standards, right? And then it's a question of whether or not you adopt those standards, okay? So in various ways, they seem to suggest that ethics is somehow impossible, right? And they do this in different kinds of ways, right? Whether it's the death of God or relativism or determinism or evolution, they tend to be a challenge to whether or not you can even develop an ethical system, okay? So really a part of what we're doing here in talking about the ideas that destabilize us is that we're mostly what we're doing then is going through and kind of looking at why these things appear to be destabilizing, and maybe they are to a certain extent, but what is it that they're really making unstable? Are they making ethics itself unstable, or are they making certain ethical and moral systems that have been traditionally adopted unstable, and can to protect those and never question them, right? Because that's one of the things that these challenges do, right? And the challenges seep into the moral environment in such a way that they create a lot of issues that sometimes make it difficult for people to come down on find some sort of common ground where they can kind of figure out, okay, so what is the basic goodness necessary between two people, right? And if one person is just adamantly whatever God says, and one person is adamantly, I don't believe in God, and I don't even think that it's possible to find anything that human beings can agree on. So you already started, you already see how the discussion is going to go off track very quickly, right? That's kind of what these things do. They show us where people may be attempting in bad faith to undermine ethics, but they also show us where people may be attempting with all the best intentions to provide an ethic, but it's an ethic that it rests on things that other people don't believe in, maybe even won't believe in, right? Okay, questions? Comments, concerns? No? All right. Let's go ahead and take a look at this then. Challenge and focus, the death of God. Now, there are, as Samantha and Andrew and David know from being in class with me last semester, there are numerous people out there who claim to disprove Friedrich Nietzsche's aphorism, God is dead. And one of the ways that they've done this is by creating 3 or 4 movies. I think they're called God is Not Dead, 1, 2, and 3 with TV's Hercules, Kevin Sorbo or whatever. And the idea here is that he plays my role. He's an asshole philosophy professor who thinks his job is to make everybody stop believing in God somehow. I don't understand where churches get this idea. Me coming in and saying, maybe if we live in a diverse society in which even the Christians don't agree on everything that they believe in, we shouldn't make our ethical standards based on religion. I don't know why that suddenly means that I'm trying to, I think it goes that way. I don't know, trying to make you lose your faith, right? But that's the way it goes. So these movies basically purport to demonstrate how easy it is to undermine a philosophical argument simply really by throwing Bible verses at somebody. Yeah, you can just keep passing that around. I don't think it's gotten around yet. Yeah. Anyway, by simply throwing enough Bible verses at a philosopher, you're going to completely and utterly undermine what it is they're attempting to do and making you lose your faith. I don't really give a fuck what you believe. I don't care. If you want to believe in the flying spaghetti monster, or if you want to believe in the Force, or if you want to believe in Buddha or Jesus or what the hell ever you want to believe in, go ahead and believe in it. I just want you, when you talk about what you believe in, to be able to say it in a coherent way that doesn't just rely on hitting people over the head. Has everybody signed the document? What's that? Oh, yeah, that's a good book. Yeah. Everybody signed? Okay. Yeah, I have. So the basic idea here is we want to kind of take a look at this death of God problem, because it's a problem for a lot of people who do believe in God. And there are a lot of people who have this, that Nietzsche must be an atheist because in an aphorism, a character is writing about God is dead. What would it mean if God is dead? Let's put a pin in there a little bit and kind of come back. Religion, they're prefabricated, have all things supposed to meet. Your rules, your military restrictions, your sexual, and all that stuff's already there. But as we sometimes what you get in these standards seems a little arbitrary. Not always, sometimes. And so kind of back to what I was saying before, in a mixed society with more than one religion, it's especially important to find an ethical path that's not undermined by fanatical adherence, right? I would actually say in the realm of some people on the left who are fanatically committed to certain progressive, it's no wonder that they get into arguments with people on the right and the far right that are fanatically adherent to certain concepts and ideas, right? Basically, what you've got going on in our country most of the time are 2 people or 2 different factions that are arguing with each other. This is not to put much subtlety into it. 2 different factions that are arguing with each other from their dogmas, right? From what they've adopted as their dogmas. Okay. And that causes a bit of a problem. Okay. Religion primarily relies on revelation to share the mind of the gods. That's fine. I actually don't deny that some texts might be revealed by the divine, but you're not going to get me to come down on whether the thing that's been revealed by the divine is the Gospels, the Bhagavad Gita, the Sutras of Buddha. I don't know which one of those things is a philosopher, right? Those are all revelations. Do what? No, I agree with that, but the reason it becomes revelatory is that a lot of people, once they begin to practice it without, right? In other words, it starts turning. It's when this is the issue with revelation. So Christian's totally right. Buddhism is actually the works that were actually promulgated by Siddhartha Gautama, the techniques and methods. They're just radical empiricism. They're just basically how do I actually stop, look, and describe and understand the processes that are going on in me, around me, through me, right? Anybody can do that. Anybody can be a Buddha. That's the whole point of it. But a lot of times what happens in sacred traditions is things get wrapped up with each other, and then people just start believing these things dogmatically, and they're not doing the practice, right? So when you actually get to the point where you're supposed to be doing what Siddhartha said to do, and all he said to do was meditate. But then there's all this other stuff that gets added onto it over the course of 2,400 years, right? All these kind of things. And people begin to believe these things because as revealed truth, right? As a revelation. Really all revealed means is the veil's taken away, right? It's discovered, it's uncovered. Reveal just means to uncover, right? All right, so religion primarily relies on revelation to share the mind of the gods. This can be done through intermediary communication from the divine through entities such as the muses or the angels, right? But it can also be directly done from the divine to a particular person who records it. And that would be like the prophet, Muhammad, Jesus. Well, Jesus didn't record anything, but Jesus told people things that they wrote down. Some of the mystical things that have been seen by certain Tibetan lamas and certain Christian monks and Islamic Sufis. These kind of things can come out to a particular person. They record it down. Then you've got to trust in that they've recorded it correctly, right? And this kind of ends up being the reason why I said I don't really care what you believe in. If you have a faith, that's fine. It's not bad to have faith in something. Have faith in something bigger than yourself. But the problem that you're going to always run down to when you start having a conversation about what might be true is that truth is either provable, and that's almost entirely in mathematics, or truth is probable, and that's in science and empirical research. There's no way to confirm a revelation. Either way, you cannot confirm it. I'm not saying you shouldn't believe it. You don't have to believe it, whatever the case may be. You can believe what you want to believe, but there's no way you can confirm it. An interesting aspect of the last 160 or 70 years, 180 years in our own Western society has been with the great success of science, all argumentation turned in the direction of empirical experiment and validation, right? What that ended up meaning is, if you actually look at the way people taught Christian Bible ideas in the 1600s versus the way they do it in the 1800s, you see the influence of, well, here they kind of seem to understand this is a revealed text. It takes faith to understand it. There's not any, it doesn't actually prove anything. You have to commit to it. But after the 1820s, definitely by the end of the 1880s, you see this change in Christian apologetics where the very existence of the Bible is somehow empirical proof, and they just draw from this as they want, as though they're drawing from empirical facts, right? So that in itself kind of shows the idea that we've come to understand how it is that that all of the different religions, maybe one of them's true, maybe they're all true, maybe none of them are true. There's really no way to know, right? So in a mixed society that does not claim, despite all the people who try to claim that that's not true, that does not claim to being a religious society. There are religious people in the society, but our government is secular, right? If we were a religious society, we would have a religious government as well as our churches and things, but we don't have that. We have a separation. Now, all kinds of people are going to argue that that's not what they really meant. That's not what this is, separation of church and state, et cetera, et cetera. Well, you know, people who say that are easily disproved because there's all kinds of evidence from the letters of the people at the time that they did indeed mean they did not want the United States to be a Christian nation per se, especially Thomas Jefferson. Yeah, he just ripped out everything he thought was good in the Bible and put it into a little bitty book, actually out of the New Testament, put it into a little bitty book and said, this is good enough. You don't need any more of the rest of this stuff, right? But the point I guess I'm trying to get at is we are a secular nation with hundreds and hundreds of religions. So a religion cannot be the basis of our ethical standards. A religion cannot be the ethical climate. A religion cannot be the way that we move through our moral environment, right? As a collective, what you do as an individual in that collective is another story, right? Because that's where you start getting into your moral commitments, okay? All right. So questioning traditions, however, often causes issues in society for the one doing the asking. I can definitely tell you one of the things that I've noticed having gone through, you know, this whole queer liberation thing since the 70s, you know, having watched it as a kid and then been involved in it in the 80s and then kind of coming to the place where I'm at now, finishing up my dissertation on these very subjects, I can tell you that anybody who says or does anything that goes against what people think is normal or traditional is always in danger, right? And that extends out beyond just questioning religion, right? Because queer people question, just by their very existence, question a lot of stuff that's taken for granted as normal. Stuff that's mostly only backed up, not by science, right? It's not backed up by science, it's backed up by religions and what they say about this thing, right? It's very dangerous to question traditions, especially in some areas. You know, here in Hearst, there was a church that was preaching that homosexuals should all be killed. This was actually just this last semester. Homosexuals and transgender people should all die. Women should be forced to go back to the house to have their shoes taken away and kept perpetually pregnant. The guy's not, this preacher is not being facetious. He thinks this is the way things should be. They took every Bible they could find that was not the King James authorized version of the Bible and burned them. Right? Because only the King James version of the Bible is the correct version of the Bible. I know that's not true. It's obviously not true. It's empirically not true. But once you get lost enough down in these things, the point I'm trying to get at here is this is a really dangerous time to be alive because there are people now who will use the if there's no God, there's no ethics argument against you with a gun in their hands. Right? These are the people who show up outside of moderate churches that are okay with queer people. They show up outside of them with rifles and guns and wearing Nazi paraphernalia. Because without their God, there is no ethics. Right? So they're going to force you to believe in their God and adopt their rules, right? And this obviously is the reason why they should be referred to as the American Taliban, because that's the same thing. That's what they're doing, right? But simply to go along with traditional standards based on their coming from a powerful entity makes it sound more like these standards are imposed upon humans rather than inherent to us. And I think that you can see just from the example I'm giving you that obviously there's a way that you can take this tradition and see it as something imposed upon you by God, and therefore something that you are required to impose on every single person around you. Right? That's kind of the standard upon it, right? So it's imposed upon us. What we want to think is what most philosophers believe, and this is actually partially based up by some evolutionary science. It makes sense that being ethical and having moral structures helps us. It's inherent to who we are. So it doesn't need an outside figure to impose on us what's right and what's wrong. You know, we have the ability to figure that out. The first thing we have to do, though, is try to determine, you know, how are we going to accomplish that? Well, that requires philosophy along with science, religion, art, and anything else that human beings do, right? We have to bring it all together and we have to kind of sift through it and think about it, right? Generally, we can say you don't have to have a God to have the golden rule, because Confucius and a number of African peoples and a number of South American and Mesoamerican peoples and first peoples in America, in the United States and Canada, all had variations of the golden rule. They'd never talked to Jesus. You don't need, right? Do unto others that which you would have them do unto you. Do not do unto others that which you would not have done unto you. Honestly, you don't have to have God to figure that out. I don't want you to fuck with me. I'm not going to fuck with you. It's pretty simple, right? You can kind of start that off as maybe a basis for doing ethics, that it's about knowing how to act responsibly. Okay. So if you get to this point, is ethics just following the rules of the strongest power, right? If we were reading Plato's Republic, one of the arguments put forward in Plato's Republic is that righteousness or morality or justice is whatever the powerful say it is. That's one of the arguments put forward. That's not the ones that Socrates agrees with. Socrates disagrees with that idea, but it's there, right? It's the notion that whoever is powerful tells you what's right and wrong. Right? Are my acts moral simply because I do what I'm told? If you just do what you're told, are you being moral? Aren't you a good boy? Such a good boy, Anwar. You always do what you're told. That's why I think that's where your real motivation comes from, that you always do what you're told and never think for yourself. So, you know, as we explore this issue, right? How can ethics be about genuine decisions if I'm simply doing what I'm told to do? It's not your choice or your decision if you're just doing what you're told to do. Then somebody's going to come in. It depends on the different religions and things. And this doesn't have to just be Christianity. Someone will come in and they may say, well, you know, Christians have seen fit to make sure that everyone has the ability to choose. So you choose to do the right thing or you choose to do the wrong thing, and then you take the karmic consequences of that, right? But once you actually get into the idea of that I have a will that can imagine an outcome, and I can use that to make a choice or a decision, and I may choose against what the Godhood says I should choose, then it stops being laws and rules and it just becomes suggestions, right? If you go that route of, if I have this free will supposedly to make a choice, then the things that have been shared with us by religion as standards of conduct, they're standards, they're procedures, they're possible paths. They're not absolutely, you have to do it this exact way, right? Okay, so as we kind of work through thinking about that, we get to a place, I think, where now we can say, well, do we just chunk out all of the stuff that we've gotten in all of these sacred traditions? I hope not. I've spent most of my life studying them, so I would have been a waste of my time. No, I'm not, it's never chunked the Bible out. It's never chunked the Gita out. It's never chunked the Tao Te Ching out. It's never that kind of stuff. It's, why do we have these texts, right? What do these texts teach us? How do they help us see something different, right? Actually, one reason that I'm able to do this is, back in my younger days, when I was 18 years old, I converted to Catholicism and wanted to be a priest. So I joined the Order of St. Augustine. Now, some of y'all may not know who St. Augustine is, but St. Augustine was a North African bishop, and he's probably the most influential thinker on Western Christianity, because both Catholic and Protestant thinkers make use of it. Okay. And Augustine was a philosopher and a theologian, but even more importantly, he was a rhetorician, meaning he was somebody who gave speeches, persuasive speeches. This is what his original job was. Yeah. St. Augustine of Hippo, not St. Augustine of Canterbury. St. Augustine, oh yeah. Yeah, he's one of the fathers of the church. So he died around 425. So he's a philosopher, theologian, rhetorician. As a rhetorician, when he approaches the text of the Bible, and I said he died in 425, there was still no official canon of what the Bible was in 425. Take that, ye who burn other things besides the King James Version of the Bible. It wasn't even around until, there wasn't even a collected, cohesive Bible until around 425. All the texts were out there, but they were floating around separate from each other. They began to say, these are the ones you can read, and then they actually put them together after about 420, like where you get them all in one book. Bible means library. It doesn't mean book, right? There are over 80, there are like 85 books in the Bible, the Christian Bible. There are 85 books, okay? Some of them are disputed, but whatever the case may be, the Bible is a library. When St. Augustine picked up any book out of this library, he treated it as a Christian, but a Christian who also was a rhetorician. And as a rhetorician, he understood that most of the Bible is allegory. What that means is St. Augustine is the bridge between Christian scholarship and evolution, because St. Augustine basically says, if you want something that was written directly by the hand of God, that's nature. These books are recorded by human beings, so they need to be taken with a grain of salt. at times, right? So what he basically said was, you have to make a determination when you're reading these stories. If your natural knowledge disagrees with what the book says, nature trumps the book, because nature is written directly by God. And then what you do is you go to symbolic interpretation. So in other words, Augustine was the first person to say, good heavens, the world was not created in 7 days. That's obviously an allegory. How you change, right? And then you also have this problem that there are 2 creation stories in the very first book of Genesis. Huh? Yeah, but I mean, just in Genesis by itself, there's the first story, which is a later story, the one that's kind of like almost philosophical. God said, "Let there be light," blah blah blah. And then there's the second story about Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and those are 2 separate stories, 2 separate things, right? So what Augustine said was, this really is going to get us back to something more general. I realize this all sounds like a lesson in Christian thinking. What he said is that when you read any sacred text, basically, the first thing you should do is see if you kind of understand what the text is saying. And then before you take it as literal, search what you understand about nature, just to make sure that you're not adopting as literal something that's supposed to be taken as a story to be interpreted, right? If something is literal, it doesn't need interpretation. 2 + 2 is 4. That needs no interpretation. Okay? When something is figurative or allegorical or mythic, it needs interpretation. So now getting back to the general idea, one of the things philosophically that we can do, something seen by St. Augustine originally as he was converting to Christianity, is we can take the knowledge we have of nature, take the knowledge we have of history, and we can utilize that to help us understand how these different sacred traditions have myths and stories that are productive, useful, enlightening for us, but that we don't have to take as literal, right? And oh, I'm sorry, Anwar.
Like these authors at the time wanted the Bible for us to.
No, because what we understand now, as we go back and do a lot of anthropological work and philological and linguistic work on these texts, we understand now that, like, if we say the prophet Daniel is considered to be a prophet because there are prophecies inside of the things that Daniel writes, right? But we understand now that more than likely the book of Daniel was written anywhere from 100 to 250 years after the period it was supposed to be set in. It's easy to be a prophet when you're actually talking about what happened already. So there's that. So again, it's never, when you're talking about that kind of literature, especially, it's called eschatology and apocalyptic literature or revelatory literature. Apocalyptic. You're actually talking about people who use metaphor, symbol, and analogy to tell folks, be careful and try to do the right thing. Right? So I think that usually what the prophets any prophets or any holy people or sacred people are saying, if you really look at these texts carefully across traditions, across religions, across cultures, that the people who make these pronouncements are attempting to provide light on a path for the people around them and maybe the people just after them. But I don't necessarily know that they meant for these things to be around forever, right? And so We can't know that. Now you're getting into the intention of the author, right? Like,
It's like. Edited,
well, I mean, how do you, this is another issue, right? It's like, so here we are in 2023. And I can tell you right now that 2023 has different ideas of what good scholarship is than we did in 1993, and different than what we had in 1963, going back and back and back. We can just keep going back generation by generation by generation. What you'll find is that the standards are always moving and changing depending on the ethical climate and moral environment that they're being interpreted and worked in, right? And if you can go all the way back to that time when people first started putting shit down, writing it down, recording it by writing it, there were no standards, right? Like one of the reasons that it takes so long to check a Platonic dialogue that's 17 or 1800 years old, an actual, not an actual copy from Plato, but a copy of a copy of a copy. One of the reasons it takes so long to check those, or to check a biblical text, or even to check one of the most ancient versions of the Quran, is that they don't have the same writing grammar that we do, right? So if you read like a Platonic text, in order to get as much onto a parchment or onto a scroll as they could, papyrus as they could, they would write like this. Well, the reason I'm doing this is there's 3 words there. If you know Greek, you know the 3 words. If you don't know Greek, you don't know the 3 words. And it's also the case that of these 3 words, they could be read as 2 words. So you actually have to, in other words, there's no space in a Platonic dialogue because they have to. So every now and then you'll find a little mark like that, which means question, and you'll find a little mark like this, which means end of statement. That's it, right? So since there's not even standards in how you write things down, there's obviously no idea about how you edit or about write. These are all things that occur as we realize we have all this documentation that we didn't know we had. And now we need to figure out how to preserve it and make it available to people who can't read New Testament Greek, or can't read Attic Platonic Greek, or can't read the original Arabic of Muhammad. Right? So this is all a very important aspect about what we're doing, right? So it's like you go to these things and you can go with them with care, and you can discover the history, even in how the texts come to us. You discover something about the history of the development of that particular tradition, right? But the real point here is that the Greek word, mythos, where we get the word myth, is literally the Greek word for narrative. That's really all it is. The Greeks had 4 or 5 words for how you, just like us, for how you tell a story, right? The logical account, the mythical account or narrative account, the tale, the epic account, or the long sung poetic version, the dramatic account, right? So these are all just different ways that they had of telling about a narrative. So when you see the word myth, a lot of people have been conditioned to treat myth means phony, false, tall tale. Really, it's just a narrative. And the narratives exist to give us some kind of direction. So it's kind of like when y'all were talking last Thursday, the pragmatic reasons for the laws in the Bible, the mystical reasons for the laws in the Bible. Somewhere in between, right? There is a way for us to share what it means to struggle in our humanity through these narratives. And the narratives give us all kinds of paradigms that we can follow, whether it's Jesus or Heracles or Adonis or Gilgamesh or the Yellow Emperor, right? Or Socrates, Confucius, Buddha. These are all people too that come to us mythically. They're paradigms, right? In fact, Karl Jaspers, who's my teacher's teacher, a German existential philosopher and psychiatrist, he said that Jesus, Socrates, Confucius, and Buddha are like the paradigmatic individuals of history, and we can use them to kind of get an idea of how an individual is part of a community and a community embraces an individual, and how those two in proper relationship can make the place better, right? So that's basically when we look at the stories, the myths and the narratives, there's a place for myths in cleaning out the moral environment toward cleaning up the ethical climate. Such stories provide paradigms, they share models and allow us to struggle imaginatively with what we will do or we did do, right? So this is, you know, you see this all the time. WWJD, what would Jesus do? And now I've seen, you know, WWDD, what would Darwin do? What would Socrates do? What would Buddha do? That's kind of the idea, right? It's like you have the models and the narratives in order to ask yourself, what would be done in this moment, right? Somehow I myself, even though I'm a heretic at this point, I'm sure, fallen very far away from Holy Mother, the Church, somehow I find it really strange that anybody who would ask, what would Jesus do, would show up outside somebody else's church with guns and Nazi paraphernalia. I don't think that's something Jesus would do, personally, even if he did come to bring a sword, right? So I really think there's a lot there that we can gain from the study of sacred traditions, but we have to be careful that we don't allow our opinions about sacred tradition to be imposed on everybody. And that includes atheists imposing their notions onto people who believe in God, right? I hate to burst the bubble of, is it Dennett that's the evolutionary author? The guy that, I can't remember his name, went out of my head. Anyway, he wrote a book about, yeah, they're mostly insufferable. The new atheists are highly insufferable people. Anyway, he wrote a book in which he talks about the belief of God as some sort of genetic disorder or something like that. I'm kind of being a little bit of an asshole with it. But the whole point here is this. Science can say nothing about God. And when scientists do it, especially to advance an atheistic argument, that's stupid. They should just leave it out of the thing, right? You don't need science to disprove the existence of God. You don't need science to do any of that kind of stuff. Really, what he's trying to do is to say that people who believe in God he's actually setting up an argument that people who believe in God are not completely human because they have a genetic defect. Yeah, remember his name is and tell us in a minute. At any rate, it's not a genetic defect. See, you can be an atheist and a scientist and still dehumanize people, right? It's not just Christians and radical Muslims and fundamentalist Christians and radical Muslims and a whole host of other people who dehumanize other people because of their opinions. You can be a scientist and atheist and do the same thing. Sam Harris, which is another new atheist, is pretty good at putting forward lots of really interesting ideas. But then when he starts talking about Islam, he totally loses all credibility, right? So this is the idea of what we're airing. How can we all, everybody in here is in different places, what you believe in spiritually and what you don't, but we're all in the same moral environment. We're all under the same ethical climate, and we have to figure out how to talk to each other whereby we can respect each other's convictions, right? Up to the point that those convictions don't dehumanize me or you or somebody else. That's always the problem, right? Nah, it's not him. I'll think about it later. It always comes to my head like an hour after I bring him up. Obviously, that's a Freudian block of some kind. You look up the God gene. Anyway, so what do y'all want to talk about now? We have 20 minutes. And I have exhausted my voice talking to y'all about all of this shit. You know, what's on your mind?
I was just thinking about how you're talking about the anonymity of
Yeah. Peter Singer, the animal activist. Yeah, I've met him. I don't like that guy very much. He's an asshole. And the fact that he has autism doesn't actually give it. He's used that as an excuse for being an asshole. That's not a good excuse for being an asshole. Yeah.
Where'd you get those socks?
Amazon. Where does anybody get anything anymore? I have a group of barely clad muscular women who make my socks. Amazon. No, yeah, they look great, don't they? I have like 15 or 20 pairs that I just mix and match, just grab them in the dark, see what happens that day. Yeah, Peter, that's fine. Oh, you're just relaxing. I thought you were.
Also, when you said bring the sword,
I saw you smile.
it brought William Dafoe to my mind. I'm always thinking,
Oh yeah, as he's Judas, right? Was he Judas or Jesus? He was Jesus. That's right. Yeah. When you consider people like Peter Singer, people like, like what's Peter Singer's thing? Peter Singer's an ethicist. So he's actually somebody we shouldn't just discount. I mean, he's a very important ethicist. He's somebody who puts forth his idea of his ethics is it's about it's oriented around animal rights, which makes him a kind of eco-ethicist or bioethicist. And basically, he's kind of a radical, like if anything has any kind of sentience, you can't do anything, you can't kill it, you can't use it, right? Any kind of sentience and you can't, right? So it's a kind of, I guess I'd say it's a kind of biocentrism, but I think it's actually more of a kind of animal centrism. It's like mostly about animals. It's not about, he doesn't talk about this with plants. He suspiciously never allows anyone to get very far in talking about the fact that plants have their own communication sense. So if sentience is about communication and knowing, sentience literally means sensing what's happening, and plants do sense what's happening. So why are they not part of the moral? Is it just because they can't move from the spot they're in? So only things that can move on their own, but they do move in the spot they're in because they move with the sun. They move, they grow up, their roots switch out and go out to other places. I think that in the end, one of the things that often happens when you really kind of try to double down on creating a prohibition inside of a society is that you have to necessarily not pay attention to a bunch of other things, right? Now, do I believe that we should torture animals just so we can have some extra food? No. But I also don't believe we should torture plants just so we can have some extra food, right? We literally have to destroy the rainforest just to have all of this great soy that everybody needs for their non-meat eating. So it doesn't make any sense, right? The one of the most probably one of the cornerstone environments left in the world that is helping to keep the world alive is the rainforest. And when you say the rainforest, you automatically know you're talking about the Amazon. Speaking of Amazon, yeah. Yes. But this is the deal. It's got a lot of protein in it. It's easy to grow. It's fairly hardy. So, and you can make a lot of money off of it. So that's the whole thing, right? But it's the same thing. We brought up coffee last week. It's the same thing. Coffee is also doing it. Cattle ranching is doing it. Everything that we do at the level of global supply is really unethical. Now, here, I think we actually get to something. This death of God thing is important to me in one sense because, there it is. It's important to me in one sense because when you take into account that we live in a interconnected global system, whether we like it or not, that's very much the way it is, right? And as the anarchists realized 30 years ago, the time to stop it was 30 years ago. Now we're in another area. That was probably the last time you could have really put a kibosh on total interconnected globalism. It was 30 years ago. Yeah. Now we're at a point, it's too late. Now we're in it. Can we stop it? Probably, but it's one of those things, it's a juggernaut. Juggernauts are stopped by putting enough things in their way to slow them down, if they ever can be slowed down, right? So we have an interconnected global system. That global system is primarily operated by aspects of neoliberal capitalism. And this comes back to what we were just talking about. I'm not too far away from it, believe me. So neoliberal capitalism is basically the notion that everything can be privatized and everything that you do should be thought of as work and labor and jobs, right? So if you go into this idea of the neoliberal capitalism, one of the things that's promulgated as an ethical response to neoliberal capitalism and all of the pollution and the fact that nothing that we actually generate inside of this global capitalism is ethical, is this statement: all consumption under capitalism is unethical. You probably heard that, right? This is an ethical climate notion. It's all around inside this global neoliberal capitalist climate. People are being told constantly, all consumption under capitalism is unethical. Here's the interesting aspect. When you do that, you shift all responsibility onto every individual person. But the people who are the most responsible are not average everyday people. Average everyday people are buying and consuming what they've been given to buy and consume inside the markets that have been created by this neoliberalism, right? You've got to eat. So if you don't grow your own vegetables, raise your own chickens, harvest your own eggs, slaughter your own cows and pigs that you grow, you don't do any of that kind of stuff, you've got to buy food somewhere. And when you buy food and you can't get to a local farmer's market, more than likely the food you buy has been picked by slave labor from prison industrial complex, or it's been produced to make a profit by destroying the Amazon rainforest, then adding more pollution to move it all the way from Brazil or Argentina up to the United States, right? So it puts all of the onus onto us. Well, we have to make the right decisions. Well, shit, you're not the ones who decide what will and won't be in Kroger. You're not the ones who decide what will and won't be sold on Amazon, right? So here's the offer. So this is problematic because individual is responsible for everything. And so another way another variation here that people are trying to get into the ethical climate is all consumables produced under capitalism are unethical. You see the difference between all consumption under capitalism unethical and all consumables produced under capitalism are unethical. You see what the difference is? What's the difference, Deanna? What? Yeah, the second's on the creators, right? You're not the ones that produce the consumables. You're just the ones who are forced to figure out, do I want this consumable or that consumable? So that first one only kicks in at the point where what you're trying to do is, can I find a producer who is the least unethical? It's literally choosing the least evil, right? Choosing the best of the worst. That's what you have. And this is also the reason at this point why so many smaller producers that are trying to get market shares, they always come with a narrative. Ben and Jerry set out to make delicious organic ice cream for their neighbors in Vermont. And now it's a worldwide phenomenon owned by the Nestle Corporation. But they get to keep the myth because the big companies can buy an umbrella of social, ethical, moral cover, right? By purchasing these things. And I mentioned last week about fair trade and direct trade coffee. There is so little of all the coffee produced in the world is fair trade or direct trade, meaning they're basically responsibly sourced and responsibly produced, whatever that means. So little is made that tomorrow, the Nestle Corporation could go onto the commodity market and buy every single pound of fair trade and direct trade coffee and turn it into a bunch of Nescafe without any issues. It wouldn't cost them that much more than it costs them to buy all the other coffee they buy. It is therefore statistically irrelevant, right? 95% of the coffee produced in the world harms the environment. I'm drinking coffee right now. I know that I'm a hypocrite. This is where you got to understand why you're forced into hypocrisy, right? Do I have to drink coffee? No. I don't drink as much coffee as I used to. I make sure now that I actually know where the coffee comes from. So there is a little bit of that direct trade thing going on. But I still know that even buying from the farmers that my friends buy from that make this coffee, I know even then their farmers are not being treated completely as well as they could be treated, even if they're getting paid a little more than the guys next door. They're farm workers. Yeah. And then you'll give up. So the real issue here is just changing, if you want to change the moral environment, the first thing you do is you look around and see what kind of ethical suggestions are being made in the marketplace, right? Like, I can't tell you how many people made small fortune over the pandemic because they switched to making masks and doing stuff like that, right? And they started doing all those things. And you know what's funny to me is I have two cousins who each made a lot of money off the pandemic, never been vaccinated, never wear a mask, don't believe in it, but they see it as a great way to get money off of woke idiots who don't know better and just are sheep that do what the government tells them to do. And then they got angry when the government stopped telling people to wear masks because they started making less money. Right? But I couldn't have any schadenfreude when my cousin got sick and was in the ICU for 2 weeks. Because that would have made me immoral. Right? But that was the consequence of their own actions. So I was worried about them and other people in their lives. But I was still at the same time, like, you're making all this money off the damn thing and you don't even believe in it, but you're here in the hospital and you still don't, because I still don't believe it. Even after being in a hospital for 2 weeks, and I don't believe that it's real. Right? So I don't know what you do with that. But at any rate, yes, this puts it all on us. The first thing you do is you look in the moral environment and you look around and ask yourself, what are the phrases that are being thrown around all the time? Right? And then ask yourself, how is that connected to the ethical climate? How is that making an ethical claim on me, or an ethical claim to change, adapt, or even drop certain things out of my moral convictions? Right? Like the same time that the whole pandemic thing was going on, the BLM movement started, right? And there were a lot of things going on with that. You know, setting aside all kinds of different issues, notice how quickly when the ethical climate was like, had kind of reached a fever pitch, and then people started saying Black Lives Matter. What was the response from other parts of the moral environment? All lives matter. Just like all consumption under capitalism is unethical, tides, all consumables produced under capitalism are unethical, all lives matter attempts to hide Black Lives Matter. Because Black Lives Matter is not about Black lives matter more than anybody else's lives. Right? It's about Black lives matter too. They're not being treated equally, right? With any equity, right? It is simply a statistical truth that no matter what state or federal prison you go to, there are 5 times more Black people in the population of a prison than there should be. Right? That 5 times more Black folk go to jail for the size of their demographic in the country than white people for the size of their demographic. Right? So the issue is, why would this hide it? I mean, technically, Black Lives Matter is simply saying we want to be included in all lives. That's what it's really saying. But if you tout this to silence that, all lives matter, what's the moral? Okay, all lives matter. So if all lives matter, then why should Black people be treated so horrendously by the police so often? I know. So this is what we're talking about when we talk about bad faith arguments, right? If I say to you in good faith, I am a human being, and the fact that I am queer should not actually matter about whether or not the police do something brutal to me for no good reason. I am Black, I am poor, I am a woman, I am whatever the marginalized may be. And I include in here the poor, so anybody who's white doesn't pipe up and say, well, I've been treated badly by the police. Yeah, more than likely because you're poor, right? Poor lives matter too. The fact that you can get so many people of the working class to adopt the all lives matter thing and hide the fact that they're also being oppressed, and they're hiding the fact from themselves, right? That's the ethical climate we live in. There's a lot of oppression. There's a lot of suffering. And somehow in the ethical climate we live in, the people enacting their daily lives through their moral environment, so many people keep collecting over in an area that is been created primarily to just manipulate them so very few people can have power. And I include Democrats and Republicans on both of those things. Remember this, I'm an anarchist, I'm not a Democrat. So if it sounds like I'm getting all up on whatever the Republicans are, believe me, in my opinion, the Democrats are centrist at best. And that's the reason that they're the left of the Republicans. They're not leftists. They're not socialists. They're not communists. They're not anarchists. They're fully ingrained in capitalism and love it. Okay. So here we go again, the same thing. If somebody says people should have effective representation and protection from the government. I'm going to say from their government, right? People should have effective representation and protection from their government. Okay. And what do you mean by that, Maggie? Well, I have an AR, but I don't need to buy one. Don't ever think that just because Democrats don't like guns, that leftists don't like guns. Yeah. So in fact, Karl Marx actually was the first person to make an argument that was basically parroted by the National Rifle Association. It was Karl Marx who said that government should never be allowed to legislate who makes the ammunition and who makes the guns, because how can you have a revolution to protect yourself from the government? That line of thinking was adopted by the National Rifle Association. I love to point out they've adopted a Marxist idea to protect their gun rights, right? But anyway, that's beside the point. That's a political gotcha. But let's get back to ethics. So if people say this, people should have effective representation and protection from their government. What do you mean by that, Maggie? I mean, well, how about I have a police force in my community that's there to protect and serve the people and not to protect the property and serve the property owners? How about I have a police force in my community that's actually there to be a detaining force, which is what it's supposed to be, and not a quasi-military force, which is what it's become, right? How about we have healthcare for everybody in the country that has paid for almost every one of the great medical advances that has occurred in the last 100 years, has been paid for by the federal government of the United States? How do I have to pay $175,000 so that a doctor can have an extra car and an extra home when everything they're using to make me healthy, the medicine, the equipment, all of the standards, was developed by tax dollars? Yeah. Oh, okay, I'll get to that in a second. So basically then what you get is this. When I say that and then I come out and I say the thing about medicine, that's socialism. Right? And that automatically hides this. As soon as you yell this, that's the fact that there are people, maybe even sitting in this room, who think that Joe Biden is a communist is ridiculous. Well, setting all that aside, the idea that that'd be an ad hominem anyway. The idea that it's ad hominem to call him a communist, but it's also ad hominem to say he's an imbecile. He's not got cognitive there. But at any rate, to say that he's a communist, to say that Nancy Pelosi is a socialist, even to say that about, this is where people don't really, they say, do your research and think for yourself, but they don't really do it, because if they did, they'd realize even AOC and Bernie Sanders are not socialists. They're still capitalists. Democratic socialism or social democrats, whatever the hell they call themselves, that's still a capitalist theory. It's not right? It's still close. It's basically what it is neo-Roosevelt New Deal, right? So so what's this all about? Then you said the thing about back to blue. How about this? Blue lives matter. Okay, so here's the thing. Insofar as they're human beings, just like black people, yeah, everything matters. But insofar as they're human beings that belong under the All Lives Matter banner, just like black people, this is a choice and a profession. It's not something you're born. So basically what you're asking me to do is to say that I will back people who've chosen to be part of an organization that regularly demonstrates it has become degenerate. Some of y'all may not agree with that. That's okay. We can debate that on Tuesday. But the fact that the police of the United States have become militarized to the degree that they've become militarized, I don't back the blue. That doesn't mean that I want that human being to be harmed. But why should I back an organization of people who have demonstrated a regular inability to respond with a protective mindset toward people? I mean, even the Supreme Court says that police don't have to protect anybody. The Supreme Court said in a ruling that a cop doesn't have to protect you because they're not a soldier. 2005 Supreme Court. Yeah. Federal law, state law, regional laws, whatever the code or the policies may be, right? Yeah. So yeah, they don't have to do anything. Now, that doesn't mean that there wouldn't be a brave person who might, courageous person who might do that. I'm not saying that. What? Yes. Yes. And so, everything is there. I understand that in a large society, you need peacekeepers. I'm not dumb. Okay. It's not like everybody goes around being, but the idea that, the go-to is to escalate as quickly as possible. Right. I watched, a policeman just lose his shit with a 14-year-old and was like, is he fixing to kill this 14-year-old for talking back to him? And if we go the route of, well, they're in danger, don't you realize they're constantly in danger? They're all the time in danger. And so therefore they've got to always have their hand on their gun, which is already pre-cocked.
The most problem is, I'm not gonna say brainwash, I don't know the right word, but they're full the power, like some
it's
cops have like that mindset.
very true.
I think it's stuff it now the practical power hungry people because you've always been. I'm of an age with you.
Yeah.
And I don't remember the world being so horrible back then.
No, and it was pretty shitty.
Before you had Barney Fife was what you looked at as a cop.
Right.
You know? But now I think it's just wrong for power.
Right. I think it always has. I just think now if there's an ability to really maximize it. Again, that doesn't mean, see, this is the issue, right? It's like not all cops are bad. So we shouldn't just throw all cops into the thing. So we're really just talking about bad cops, right? What's interesting is when you look at the amount of police who lose their jobs because of family violence, because they committed some kind of perjury, they did something, you know, they did all these kind of things. You take that into account and take in how many of them have, you know, escalated violence and all the rest of it. It's much higher statistical version. It's like, depending on the state, it's 13 to 18% of the force. That's a high number, right? That's a much higher number than the few people that are regular citizens that get in trouble that make up the proportion of the general population, right? All right, so let's get out of here now. We'll come back to this and we'll talk a little bit more about this maybe when we do the relativity stuff, but definitely a little later on when we do some of the other issues, okay? All right, I'll talk to you on Tuesday. Read the little section on relativism.